welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about my struggles with perfectionism and procrastination and how I've been working through them and trying to understand them as someone with ADHD and anxiety. At the same time, I'm going to take you along as I do pen things, for lack of a better way to describe it. So that's going to include cleaning out some pens that have recently run out of ink and need to be cleaned out so that I can re-ink them. And this includes my mom's old Parker45. So this pen is the first of the two vintage pens that she's given me that I am going to try to clean out and see if I can ink up and use. And maybe some other fun things like working on my pen log and catching you up on a very casual 30 inks, 30 days thing that I am doing for April. Also, I have some quick updates before I get started. In my last video, I mentioned staining the inside of my TSL A5 leather cover that I use for my Hobonichi cousin. And after failing to remove the ink stain with alcohol and then water with a little bit of dish soap, I decided to try using saddle soap. And after I did that, I didn't like the massive dark spot that the saddle soap left when I was trying to clean up the stain. So that led me to putting saddle soap all over the inner cover to try to even out the dark spot, and that led to making the entire cover blotchy. So let me just take out my cousin really quickly. So this is what the cover looked like before I got an ink stain on. You can see that it was, in this lighting, it actually looks even more pale than it does in person, but it's pretty light. And then the outside looks like this. Again, it's coming up a little more like beigey on camera, but it's a little more like peachy toned. And then this is what it looks like with the saddle soap. I did notice these spots and I tried to get more of it over in the other spots to even it out, but I think it's time to just walk away and let it be blotchy. And when it starts to get sunny outside, maybe I'll try doing some tanning in case that helps. And this ink stain, I think, is here to stay. I haven't decided what I want to do with the back cover because it does feel a bit odd that this is so dark and this is so light. Yes, it bothers me, and I'm gonna accept it because I'm not gonna buy a new cover. And the point of getting this cover was to let it age naturally over time and darken as I continued to use it throughout the year. So I suppose I accelerated it a little bit. The cover itself still works great, and I'm just going to put it back on my cousin and move on. Just wanted to share that quick update. If you have any tips for me, let me know, but I am pretty sure I'm aware that I've maybe ruined the inner cover a little bit, and we're just going to accept that. The other update I wanted to share is I talked in a few videos ago that I had gotten the Sailor Hocoro dip pen, and I liked it because it was affordable and it allowed me to try out inks without having to ink up a pen and clean the whole thing out. It works really well, but I noticed the other day that there's already some cracks at the bottom. I mean, the pen still works, but I'm a little disappointed at this. And maybe this is user error somehow, but I store this in my utility case that stays on my desk. So it's not like I'm carrying this around. It's not really getting jostled too much. So I'm kind of surprised that it cracked so quickly. But anyway, I just wanted to share it. I'm a little sad about this. I thought this was a really affordable option for playing around with inks, and I guess it still is, but I'm kind of sad that it's cracked so soon. Okay, Well, let's get into it. Grab yourself a beverage of choice and a cozy activity and join me for this week's discussion topic. This week's discussion topic was actually inspired by my very impressive ability to procrastinate on something that I've been meaning to do for a while, and that is cleaning out and trying to use one of my mom's old pens that she gifted to me like over half a year ago. So let me paint a picture of what this pen represents in terms of patterns that I get into. My mom gave me this pen over 6 months ago. It was a very sweet gift. She gave me this pen as well, and it was a really sweet gift. I love the fact that I have an opportunity to use one of her pens that she would have used, and every time I pull out these two pens, I admire them, I take off the cap, I look at them, I think, oh, it'll be so nice to try using them to see how it compares to a pen that I got recently. And then I contemplate taking a step towards cleaning it. I realize I don't really know where to get started. I feel paralyzed with indecision on how I might approach it, what to research, what tools I might need. So then I put it back in my pen roll, close it up, and I walk away. I did the same thing with my Traveler's Notebook Diner set. I got that last year because I love the camel covers, and it was my first special edition Traveler's Notebook cover, and I got really excited that I happened to get the email with the pre-order at just the right time that I was able to get myself one of the diner set covers. And once I got it, every so often I would take everything out of the package, the charms that came with it, the sticker sets, the notebook cover. I would look at everything, admire it, feel overwhelmed with not knowing how I would use it, and then I would carefully place everything back in the plastic wrap and put it back on my shelf and walk away until the next time that I would do that. And I'm choosing to talk about these examples of my mom's pen and my Traveler's Notebook cover just to keep things relatively lighthearted in this video. But you can replace pen and being paralyzed with indecision and taking steps towards resolving the paralysis or the indecision that I was feeling with work, school, or any kind of life example. So my problems can really be summed up as I struggle to get started, and when I eventually do get started, after spending a lot of energy contemplating, I tend to have issues completing the task in a timely manner that doesn't involve a lot of worry and stress. And I'm sure you can imagine how quickly that could lead to burnout in certain situations, especially when it comes to work and school and life. So basically all areas of my life. So anyway, back to this pen. When I'm looking at this pen and I'm contemplating, cleaning it and using it, it might be like super simple. It might be as simple as flushing it out with water and then inking it up with ink. But I wouldn't know that because I haven't actually tried to do anything about it. I've just held this pen, I've admired it, and then I've tucked it away in my pen roll and walked away. And when I'm holding this pen, I'm thinking things like, I have to learn and research every aspect of the pen and how to clean it before I can even start. Or what if I use the wrong ink and I completely destroy the pen? Or if I clean the ink incorrectly, I might rust something, or I might crack parts of the pen, and then it'll just be completely unusable. Whether those fears are warranted or not is up for debate, but they're there, and they tend to evoke a freeze response in me where I just really have trouble getting started, and I start ruminating and worrying. And again, I know we're just talking about a pen, but I'm also really talking about how I approach a lot of different situations in my life. So you can imagine how that could lead to a lot of anxiety. And so my issue of this excessive worry and rumination over cleaning the pen, or whatever example you want to insert there, are examples of how my perfectionism tendencies can affect my ability to start and complete a task. And typically, my way of coping with this excessive worry and rumination and perfectionism thoughts are to avoid it for as long as possible through procrastination. And this leads me in an unhelpful cycle of procrastinating and avoiding starting a task because I'm so worried about doing it properly, whatever right or properly means. I'll spend lots of time around trying to figure out how to do it right. And then once I get started, because it's difficult for me to predict how long it's going to take for me to do it, especially if it's something that I'm doing for the first time, then I'll just get in a worry cycle all over again about that, because it leads to me being unable to make plans around when I'm going to be done the task, because I'm someone who struggles with being able to scope tasks properly. In a situation like this, when it comes to work or school, I still get things done on time. If there's a timeline, I still make that timeline. But getting to that finish line and submitting whatever my final deliverable is always involves a ridiculous amount of excessive worry and rumination and energy just to get to the finish line. And then, unsurprisingly, once I get there, I get really exhausted. By the way, I'm not sure if you can hear, but it is raining really heavily outside, and we are experiencing a string of rainy days. So I hope you don't mind the rain in the background, and it is really dark, so I have decided to lean into it. I've got a candle going, and I've got my tea. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. This is a bit chaotic. Okay, so anyway, I talked about how my excessive worry and rumination can lead me to getting into this unhelpful cycle of procrastination and task avoidance, and then having to spend a lot of energy getting something done because I've wasted so much time worrying. And for something like a pen, that's fine. You know, no one's waiting around for me to clean this pen. No one's affected by the fact that I haven't cleaned it or I haven't used it yet, apart from me because I want to try using it. But when it comes to school or work, this cycle could become really problematic and stressful. And there's also an added pressure that I put on myself to meet my deadlines and deliver work that meets my personal standards, as well as what I perceive my colleagues and clients to have for my work. And there are a few things that can help explain how I might be experiencing these problems of perfectionism, procrastination, and stress. Perfectionism, at least the type that is unhelpful in the way I've been describing it, is described as having an overdependence on self-evaluation and an unrealistic pursuit of self-imposed standards and demands. And unsurprisingly, it has been found to contribute to a lot of anxiety. Procrastination is the act of delaying an intended action, so pen or something at work or something at school, despite knowing that the consequences of this delay will be worse if the action had just been taken immediately. If I hadn't spent so much time procrastinating on researching this pen or cleaning it or doing something about it, I could be using it right now and enjoying it. But the longer I delay, the higher the consequences. And I guess maybe that might not work so well with the pen because there isn't really anyone relying on me to use this pen. But if we're talking about a workplace situation, the consequences of me delaying working on a report just means that I'm gonna have to work the whole weekend or a lot of late nights to get it to the finish line on time, because I wouldn't feel right about asking for an extension if the reason why I am not able to get it done on time is because I have procrastinated and I was unproductive during the working day. So unfortunately, the consequence is that I just have to make up the hours on my own time, which is not ideal. And anxiety can be described as responses to perceived threats and the uncertainty that surrounds those threats. The thing I want to point out is anxiety in general is a natural response and one that can be resolved as soon as a threat goes away. So if I'm feeling some anxiety before a driving test, that is a natural response, because if I don't pass the test, it just means that I'm going to have to maybe study again, practice again, and then have to wait until I can book another test and try to get my license. And if I don't get my license, that means that I can't drive. So it's understandable to feel some anxiety around certain situations. However, in the event that I pass the test and I get my driver's license, then that anxiety is resolved. And so having a little bit of anxiety probably made me study a little bit harder to make sure that I did well during the test and was able to pass and get my license. In that case, it was helpful. It's when anxiety responses become really exaggerated and you start to notice coping behaviors like procrastination come into play and are used to protect against the threat. Doing that means the actual fear of the threat is left unchallenged and intact, and then you just end up in this loop. So if I'm really worried about a school paper that I have due, a major paper, and I'm feeling a lot of anxiety around it, then that's understandable, because maybe I need to get a certain mark on the paper in order to pass the class. And there are consequences to not passing, like having to pay for the course over again, that kind of thing. Maybe it prevents me from being able to take the next course. So it would be understandable to feel anxiety around a major paper. If I were to adopt a coping behavior like procrastination, then I might take 10 times longer to get around to working on this paper. And avoiding working on it in a way is kind of preventing me from facing the task of completing the paper, which would get me closer to the finish line of finishing the course and being able to move on to the next one and not have to worry about, take away the fear of failing the course, because I'll have been taking steps towards working on it. And that actual fear is left unchallenged. And so that anxiety loop is one that I am well acquainted with. And the unfortunate thing is, if I procrastinate and finally submit the paper and end up doing really well, then an added complexity to that is I've been rewarded for my behavior. And the consequence isn't that I didn't get the paper done, because I did, and in this example, I did well and I was able to move on. The actual consequence to me is the fact that I expended so much energy worrying and procrastinating, and I'm exhausted. So if I had done the paper earlier and finished it earlier, then I could have saved myself so much time worrying. And I probably dropped a lot of other tasks that I wasn't able to do in that time. Like maybe I wasn't able to see friends because I was so busy worrying and procrastinating about my paper. Or maybe I wasn't keeping up with house chores because I was procrastinating so hard and having to fill up the time, having to stay up really late to make up for all the hours in the day that I didn't work on my paper. Those are some examples of some consequences that came from procrastinating. And even though the end result objectively seems like it worked out, there were some negative outcomes as well that are less easy to see, but they can show up in later situations when I repeat this loop. So one way that I've been exploring this loop that I'm getting into and these problems that I'm experiencing is to consider whether it's being driven by my ADHD or my anxiety. So If I want to explore whether my procrastination is related to my ADHD, I might consider things like, am I procrastinating because I can't actually stay focused on the task? Is writing the paper really hard for me because every time I sit down to write it, I get super distracted and I lack focus, and therefore I end up having to stay up late to work on things because I wasn't productive enough during the day? Or is it that my procrastination stems from a feel of failure of the task? And if that's the case, then maybe it's a little more related to anxiety. So a problem with perfectionism and anxiety is when I have unrealistic standards and demands of myself and I meet that standard, then my anxiety is temporarily alleviated, which is great. But it also means that I've maintained this unrealistic standard the next time I do something. And it also means I'm a little more tired than I was before because I expended so much energy ruminating and worrying, and I probably lost a lot of sleep in the process, and all of that probably took a hit on my overall health and wellness. And this cycle begins where I start to expect myself to continually meet this standard. And if the threat of not meeting it comes up, then I might start turning to more coping behaviors like procrastination. And instead of facing the threat of not meeting the standard, I procrastinate as long as I can to avoid this outcome. And I end up leaving the threat unchallenged for as long as possible and intact. So in this particular case of the pen, let's take a look at some of those thoughts I had. I was saying things like, I have to learn and research every aspect of the pen and how to clean it before I start. And what if I use the wrong ink and I completely destroy the pen? Or what if I clean the pen wrong and then it rusts somehow, or I crack it and then it's just completely unusable? Those sound like more fear of failure. So one more concept I'm going to throw into the mix is the concept of cognitive distortions, and particularly the ones that can be driving the perfectionism in the first place. A cognitive distortion is a fancy way of saying they're negative thoughts a person can have that can lead to inaccurate perceptions of reality. And there are a bunch of them that are commonly experienced by everyone. I'm going to focus on the few that I could see present based on some of the thoughts that I shared earlier today. So when I say something like, I have to learn and research every aspect of the pen and how to clean it before I start, otherwise there's no point in even starting. That could be an example of all or nothing thinking, and that is viewing something as either or without considering that there's a full spectrum and range of possible outcomes or evaluations. So in this case, my thinking is like either I learn and research everything or I don't even bother starting. And the other two thoughts where I said, what if I use the wrong ink and I completely destroy the pen? Or what if I clean the ink incorrectly and I rust or crack it and then the pen is completely unusable? Those two could be examples of catastrophizing, which is when I start making negative predictions about some kind of future based on very little or no evidence. And thoughts like this can be really damaging because it feeds into my worry and my anxiety, and then it could lead to me procrastinating because I'm trying to avoid those uncomfortable feelings of anxiety and wanting to do things. So if I can't do something, perfectly, essentially, then I don't want to do it at all. So now that we have an idea of what I'm worrying about, what's driving my perfectionism, that's leading to procrastination, and then is leading to even more worry and anxiety because I'm not actually dealing with it, what have I been doing to try to manage that? Well, the first thing that I have been practicing over the last while is self-compassion. I know I've talked about this a lot, but it's definitely an ongoing practice for me. So self-compassion in this case could look like me saying to myself, hey, It's a sentimental pen, and there's only one pen that my mom actually used and tucked away, so it's understandable that I would want to take good care of it. And if I were to ruin it because maybe I didn't take a little bit of time to learn about how I could approach this situation or how I could approach cleaning it after it had been sitting dormant for, decades, those are understandable concerns and worries. And another way that I can tackle those unhelpful thoughts, those cognitive distortions, is I could try to reframe them and kind of challenge them a little bit. So this isn't the same thing as minimizing them. I'm not dismissing them and saying things like, oh, you're overthinking it, just don't worry about it, or it doesn't matter. Those aren't really helpful responses to someone who's already struggling with those kinds of thoughts. So I'm not going to say those things to myself. It does matter. And I'm overthinking it because I care. Another way to reframe it could be with self-compassion, like I said, so acknowledging that it is a sentimental pen and it does matter to me, and that there are some good reasons why I would be worried about ruining it. At the same time, I can also consider alternative responses, like it's unlikely that by flushing water through the pen, I'm going to destroy it entirely. And as long as I'm really careful and maybe I do a bit of research, it's unlikely that I will completely rust the pen or crack it. When it comes to those catastrophizing thoughts, another thing I can do is I can explore that worst case scenario and let my mind go there and try to work out whether it really is as much of a catastrophe as I'm thinking it'll be. So what happens if my worst scenario or my worst case fears come true? Well, if the pen ends up cracking, that would be really unfortunate. But what are my options? Because I kind of ended as, the pen cracks and that's it. But maybe I could try getting it repaired by a professional. Or maybe I could do some extra research on the type of pen that it is. Or if I use the wrong ink, well, I can flush it out right away and maybe I could try something else. Or I could do some research and find out what types of inks are safer for vintage pens, if that's even something to be concerned about. And when it comes to working through the avoidance and the procrastination, I can create some small experiments or small activities to break down the task. So that could look like starting with something really neutral to clean the pen, like just water, flushing it through the pen and seeing if that's enough, and maybe wiping down the nib immediately so that I don't have to worry about rust, if that's even something I need to worry about. And after I do that, I can examine the pen and double check if it's looking better or worse. If it's looking worse, maybe I pause and maybe I reach out to someone for help. Maybe I look into a professional to see if they can help. But if it's not looking worse and it feels like it could use a stronger clean, then maybe I could move on to trying something like water with a little bit of dish soap and flushing the pen that way. I could watch 1 or 2 YouTube videos on cleaning before I get started. And this is really where writing down things in a to-do list is helpful. This is something that I've been practicing for a while, and I know it helps when I break things down into ridiculously small tasks. Like, instead of saying, well, clean the pen and ink it up. Maybe that works for some people and that is fine. But me, who struggles with perfectionism and anxiety and ADHD, it's a lot more helpful for me to break it down. So something like, start with water, flush it out, see what happens. Don't do anything else until you feel confident that you haven't made it worse. Maybe watch some YouTube videos on cleaning before you get started. And move on to something gentle like water with a touch of dish soap before you jump ahead to something even stronger to use the pen. And also celebrate some small victories along the way. I received a lot of really helpful comments when I shared my video and talked about this pen in the first place. A lot of really kind people gave me some pointers on how I could start my research. So I have a starting point for looking into the Schaefer pen and this Parker pen to see if there are already tutorials out there on how to properly clean and maintain this pen based on whatever materials it was made of. So I actually already have a good starting point and I am ready to begin. So that's all that I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. I know we spent a lot of time talking about a pen, but in reality, this kind of pattern is something that I experience in a lot of different areas of my life, and it has taken a lot of intentional practice to break down the things that I'm avoiding and try to work through the discomfort instead of avoiding it, and identify my thoughts and challenge myself a little bit and explore situations that I'm afraid of exploring, so that instead of avoiding and worrying about them happening, being more prepared to work through them if they do happen. So I would love to know if you struggle with perfectionism and or procrastination, how do you manage it? Is it something that you're able to keep to a level where it's not completely impairing you? I think struggles with perfectionism and procrastination is a relatively common experience, but I'm curious if it ever gets to the point where it prevents you from functioning and could potentially be leading to burnout, as I'm sure it has contributed to mine in the past. I'd love to hear from you and how you've been managing it. And if you have any tips for how I'm cleaning and maintaining any of my pens, please feel free to share. I'm still very new to this hobby. There is no shortage of information out there, so it can get overwhelming when you start to look. So sometimes I have to limit how much research I do because there's a lot that you can learn and read about. But I do want to enjoy my pens for a long time, and taking good care of them is really important to me. So I'm all ears if you have tips. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for being here and sticking around. I appreciate you, and I will see you soon in the next video. Bye!